I never believed in ghosts. At least I didn't until that night. My name is Mark, and I'm from a small town in the Midwest. Winters are brutal here. Snowstorms that turn the streets into ghost towns, temperatures that drop so low your breath freezes in the air. But that's nothing compared to the terror I went through on one winter night that still haunts me. It started when I decided to spend a weekend at a cabin up north. It wasn't my first time renting it, and I was looking forward to a quiet retreat. No phones, no internet, just me, the fire, and the snow. It was the kind of place you go when you want to be completely isolated. I thought it would be peaceful, even cozy. When I arrived, everything seemed normal. The cabin was small, but charming. It was built right on the edge of a thick forest, with windows that looked out over acres of snow-covered trees. The kind of view that felt endless, like the woods went on forever. I unpacked my things, set up a fire in the stone fireplace, and cracked open a bottle of whiskey. It was the perfect setup, peaceful and remote. But there was something strange about the place that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. It wasn't the weight of the snow or the cold. It was something else, something older. That night, as the wind howled outside, I settled into a worn leather chair by the fire. The warmth of the flames was comforting, and I soon found myself dozing off, the whiskey slowly taking its toll. That's when I heard the sound, the faintest whisper of footsteps. I didn't think much of it at first. It was probably the wind, I told myself. The old wooden floors creaked with every gust of wind, and I knew that the place was far from perfect. But then the footsteps grew louder, steady, measured. It wasn't the sound of wind or the house settling. It was someone walking, someone right outside. I stood up and crept to the window, peeking through the heavy curtains. The snow was coming down harder now, swirling around in thick gusts, but I saw nothing. No footprints in the fresh snow. No shadow. Nothing. I shook my head, muttering to myself, "It's just your imagination, Mark. You're tired." But as I turned to go back to my chair, I heard something that froze me in place. A whisper. A soft, almost inaudible voice coming from somewhere deep inside the cabin. "Mark." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. There was no one else here. I was alone. "Mark." The voice came again, this time louder, clearer, almost demanding. It was a voice that didn't belong in this world. It was distant and cold, like a whisper from the grave. I grabbed the fireplace poker, my hands trembling. I told myself it was just a draft, just the wind playing tricks. But the voice wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was real, and it was calling me. I turned toward the hallway, the dark shadows stretching long in the flickering light of the fire. I could see nothing, but I could feel something in the air, an oppressive presence watching me. Then I heard it again, a sound, low and guttural, almost like someone dragging their fingers across the floorboards. It was coming from the hallway, from the room just beyond my view. Without thinking, I took a step forward, the poker raised, my mind racing. I told myself I was being foolish. I told myself to stop, but I couldn't. The hallway light flickered, casting strange, eerie shadows on the walls. I stepped into the dark, my breath shallow. Every creak of the floor beneath my boots sounded like thunder in the stillness. And then, just as I reached the doorframe, the temperature dropped. I could see my breath in the air, thick and white like a fog. That's when I saw it. Standing at the end of the hall, partially hidden in the darkness, was a figure. A man, or something that looked like a man. He was tall, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his face obscured by the shadow. I stood there, frozen in terror, as the figure took a slow step forward. I could feel it. This was no ordinary person. This was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me with what felt like an endless gaze. Then I heard the voice again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a scream, loud, agonizing, filled with pain. "Mark, get out!" The figure moved closer, gliding toward me, his footsteps silent. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I slammed the door behind me and bolted it shut, my mind racing. But it wasn't over. I could still feel it, the cold, the presence, the suffocating weight that pressed against me. I rushed to the window, peering outside, hoping to find something, anything, to explain what had just happened. The snowstorm was growing worse, the wind howling like a chorus of ghosts. But then through the swirling snow, I saw something. A figure standing at the edge of the forest. A tall, dark silhouette. I blinked and it was gone. Just like that. Vanished into the storm. I don't remember much after that. I remember sitting by the fire, too terrified to sleep, that my eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and unease. But when the storm finally died down and the sun rose the next morning, I thought it would all be over. I was wrong. When I went to leave the cabin, I noticed something strange. The front door, which I was sure I had locked, was wide open. And outside, in the fresh snow, there were footprints, small, uneven steps, leading from the door into the woods. The footprints weren't mine. I hadn't been outside since I arrived, but they were there, clear as day. I turned and looked the cabin one last time before I left. It stood there, silent and still, like it was waiting for me to come back. And I know it's still out there. The figure, the voice, the cold. I don't know who or what it was. Maybe it's a spirit trapped in that cabin for eternity, or maybe it's something older, something darker that the forest has been hiding for centuries. But whatever it is, it still watches, it still waits, and every winter when the snow falls and the wind howls, I can feel it calling my name. Mark.
Next story.
It was one of those bitterly cold winter nights when the wind howls and the air is so frigid it bites at your skin. The kind of night that feels like the world outside is holding its breath. I remember it like it was yesterday, though it happened years ago. I still can't shake the terror that gripped me that night, and I don't think I ever will. It started when I went to visit my family up north. They live in a small, isolated town in the mountains, the kind of place where snow drifts gather in thick layers on the ground, and the trees seem to lean in on you as though they're trying to keep secrets. I hadn't seen them in months, and I thought it'd be a nice getaway from the hustle of city life. So I packed up and drove through the snow to their little cabin in the woods. When I got there, the air was so cold it felt like my lungs froze with each breath. I arrived just before dusk, the sun hanging low in the sky like it was too tired to climb any higher. My parents were happy to see me, of course, but there was something different in their eyes, something off. My mom kept glancing at the windows like she was expecting someone or something to appear. My dad was quiet, more so than usual, and when I asked him what was wrong, he just gave me a strained smile and said everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine. As night fell, the temperature dropped even further. We sat around the fire, talking and laughing, but the house felt colder than it should have. Even with the fireplace crackling, the chill lingered in the air. After dinner, my parents went to bed, and I decided to take a walk outside. The snow had stopped falling, and the moon was bright enough to light the forest in a soft, eerie glow. I had always loved the peacefulness of the woods at night, but that night, it was different. I walked along the path that led to a small clearing, my boots crunching in the snow with each step. The wind whispered through the trees, and the distant sound of branches creaking made me feel like I wasn't alone. I tried to shake the feeling, but it wouldn't go away. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a figure, standing near the edge of the clearing. It was too far away to make out any details, but I could tell it was tall, unnaturally tall. The thing that stood out the most was the way it seemed to sway, like it was being blown by the wind, but no wind was there. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. I called out, thinking maybe it was a person, but the figure didn't move. My instinct was to run back to the house, but something held me there, rooted to the spot. I kept watching it, my eyes locked on the strange shape. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to move toward me. The snow crunched beneath its feet, but it didn't leave any tracks. That's when the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned and bolted, running as fast as I could, my breath coming in quick gasps. The snow made it harder to get a good grip on the ground, but I pushed myself harder, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear footsteps behind me, not in the snow, but in the air, like something was following me, matching my pace. My thoughts were a blur. I was scared, terrified even, but I couldn't stop running. I had to get back to the cabin. When I finally reached the house, I slammed the door behind me and locked it, gasping for breath. I looked out the window, my hands shaking as I tried to steady myself. There was nothing there, no figure. no movement, just the silent, cold night. I was relieved but confused. I couldn't explain what had happened. My parents came down to check on me, worried about the look on my face. I tried to tell them, but they just brushed it off, saying I was probably seeing. The cold can do that to you, my dad said. It messes with your head. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I felt. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. Eventually, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, things got worse. When I woke up, the house was eerily quiet. My parents were gone. I assumed they had gone out for a walk, but it didn't make sense. It wasn't safe to wander around in the woods alone, especially with the snow and the freezing temperatures. I waited for hours, pacing the house and trying to calm myself down. But the more I waited, the more I realized something was terribly wrong. I went outside, calling for them, but there was no answer. The wind had picked up, and the snow was coming down harder now, making it almost impossible to see. I trudged through the thickening snow, hoping to find them. After what felt like hours, I finally found something. Their footprints, leading into the woods, but there was something off about them. They were deep, too deep, like someone, or something, had been walking with heavy, dragging steps. I followed the trail, my heart pounding, and it led me to the same clearing I had been to the night before. That's when I saw it again, the tall figure, standing at the far side of the clearing. This time I could see it more clearly. It had a humanoid shape, but its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its limbs were unnaturally long. Its eyes, those eyes, I can't even describe them. They were hollow, dark pits, like there was nothing inside, just emptiness. I froze, my blood turning to ice. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me. And then I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was there, whispering, and it sounded like my parents. "Come closer," it whispered, though the voice was wrong. Distorted. Not quite right. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My feet were frozen to the ground, and the wind was howling in my ears, drowning out everything but that voice. "Come closer. We're waiting." It wasn't my parents. It wasn't them. It was something else, something that had taken their form. I don't know how, but I knew I had to get away. I forced myself to turn, to run, and the moment I did, the snow around me seemed to freeze, my breath coming in short gasps. But I didn't look back. I ran, and I didn't stop running. I ran all the way back to the house, back to safety. And when I finally got inside, I locked the door again and stayed there, trembling, waiting for the sun to rise. When my parents returned the next day, they didn't remember anything. They had no idea what I was talking about. It was like the whole thing had been a dream, a horrible nightmare that I couldn't escape. But I knew the truth. That thing in the woods, it was real. And it was still out there, waiting for someone to wander too far into its domain. It's been years since that night, but I still can't forget. Every winter, when the snow starts to fall, I remember the hollow, dark eyes and the voice whispering in the cold wind. I don't know if anyone else has encountered it. Maybe I was just unlucky. But I'll tell you this, if you ever find yourself in the woods during a winter storm, be careful, because not all things in the dark are natural. Some are born from something darker, something that waits for the perfect moment to claim its next victim. And I hope for your sake, that moment isn't too soon.
Next story.
It was the winter of 1998, and I was staying at my cousin's cabin in the middle of nowhere. My family had always gone there for the holidays, escaping the chaos of city life and the pressure of being around extended family. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, far from any neighbors or even the nearest road, which gave it a sense of isolation that was both peaceful and unnerving at times. This year, however, was different. It wasn't the cold or the snowstorm that came through the night before. No, it was something far darker. I arrived a few days before Christmas, joining my cousin Sarah and her husband Tom. The cabin was always cozy, with a fire crackling in the hearth and the smell of pine trees mixed with the scent of fresh baking. Everything about it felt like the perfect holiday escape, until I began to notice the strange things happening. At first, it was small stuff. The lights flickered in the living room, but when I checked the circuit breaker, everything seemed fine. The floorboards creaked, even though no one was walking around. I thought nothing of it. Old houses tend to make strange noises in the cold. But then things began to escalate. One night, after we had eaten dinner, I went upstairs to my room to read. As I opened the door, I felt a strange chill hit my face. The room, despite the roaring fire downstairs, was unusually cold. I brushed it off as just the draft from the old windows and pulled the covers up around me. But then the whispering started. It was soft at first, so faint I almost thought I was imagining it. But then it grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like a low murmur, of a voice that was just on the edge of hearing. I sat up, straining to listen. The voice was coming from outside the window, a soft whispering in the snow-filled night. My heart began to pound in my chest. I opened the window, hoping to hear what it was. Nothing. The wind howled through the trees, but there were no voices. The snow was falling heavily, blanketing everything in a thick layer of white. Just the wind, I whispered to myself, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. But that night, as I tried to sleep, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me from the woods. The next day, I mentioned it to Sarah and Tom, but they just laughed it off. "Probably just some old noises from the cabin," Sarah said. "This place has a history of doing weird things. Don't let it get to you." I wanted to believe her, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder now, clearer, as if someone was standing just outside my window, speaking directly to me. I didn't dare open the window this time. Instead, pulled the covers tightly around myself, hoping that whatever it was would leave me alone. But it didn't. The whispers grew into words, then into full sentences, and they were speaking to me, calling my name. "Come outside. We're waiting for you." My blood ran cold. I could barely breathe, my chest tightening with every word. The voice was no longer distant. It was as if it was inside the room with me, right beside my bed. I felt paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to scream. "Come outside," it said again, its tone now mocking. "You belong with us." I finally managed to push myself out of bed and ran to the door, my heart racing in my chest. But when I opened it, there was nothing. No one outside. Just the empty, snow-covered yard and the dark shadows of the trees stretching out into the night. I slammed the door shut and locked it, trying to steady my breathing. I could feel the air grow colder, even colder than before, and I noticed a figure standing in the distance, half hidden behind a tree. It was tall, impossibly thin, with arms that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Its face was pale and featureless, just a blank, smooth surface with no eyes, no mouth, just empty space. The figure didn't move, but it was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I closed the blinds quickly, my hands shaking uncontrollably. My thoughts were a blur of fear and confusion. What was it? What did it want? I lay back down in bed, too terrified to sleep, my eyes darting to the window every few seconds. But no matter how many times I checked, the figure was gone. The next morning, I told Sarah and Tom everything. Sarah listened carefully, her face pale, but Tom just laughed it off. "You're probably just stressed from the holidays," he said. "You know how this old place gets. It plays tricks on people." But I wasn't convinced. Something was wrong with that cabin. Something dark had settled in those woods long ago, and now it was waking up. That afternoon, we decided to take a walk through the woods to clear our heads. Sarah and Tom led the way, but I lagged behind, my mind racing. I could still feel the coldness of the air and the faint whispers that had haunted me the night before. As we walked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves felt like it was just behind me, watching, waiting. When we reached a small clearing, I stopped and turned around. Nothing was there, but I could feel it. The presence of something ancient, something that had always been there, lurking in the shadows of the trees. Then I saw it again, the figure. It was standing at the edge of the clearing just like the night before, tall, thin, and faceless. I froze, unable to move. My legs felt like they were cemented to the ground. "Run!" I screamed, but it was too late. Sarah and Tom turned around just in time to see the figure move toward us, its long limbs stretching unnaturally, its body twisting and distorting with each step. We turned and ran, pushing through the thick snow, but it was faster than us. It was gaining on us, its twisted body lurching forward, its whisper growing louder with each step. It was calling to us, its voice now a twisted chant that sent chills down my spine. "Come to us," it said. You're ours now." I didn't know how, but I suddenly found the strength to run faster, my lungs burning as I pushed through the snow. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just had to get away. When we finally made it back to the cabin, we slammed the door shut and locked it behind us. But even inside, the presence lingered. We could hear the whispers coming from outside, faint but unmistakable. It was waiting for us. That night, we didn't sleep. We huddled together, every sound outside making us jump, every creak of the cabin's old walls sending us into a panic. The next morning, when we finally gathered the courage to leave, the snowstorm had stopped and everything was eerily quiet. The figure was gone. But we all knew that whatever it was, whatever we had seen, was still out there, waiting. And if we ever returned, it would be waiting for us again. I don't know if it was a curse on the land or something older, something that had been there long before the cabin was built. But I do know this. We never went back. And every winter since, I've kept my distance from the woods because some things should never be disturbed.
Next story.
I've always been the type of person who brushes off the supernatural. Ghost stories were fun to tell around a campfire, but I never believed in them. That was until the winter of 2016, when I rented a house in the mountains for a short vacation. The weather was cold, and the isolation sounded like the perfect escape after a stressful year. I figured I'd have some peace and quiet, enjoy the snow, and clear my head. The house was located near a small town in the Appalachians. I had driven up the winding mountain roads for a couple of hours before I finally reached the property. It was a beautiful house made of stone and wood surrounded by tall pine trees covered in snow. There was a large front porch, and the view from the windows was breathtaking, snow falling gently on the forest below. I couldn't have asked for a better place to get away. When I arrived, I was greeted by a local woman, the housekeeper, who showed me around. Her name was Margaret, and she seemed a bit off. She was friendly enough, but there was something about her that felt strange, like she wasn't entirely present, if that makes sense. Her eyes darted nervously around the house as she showed me the rooms, and she seemed particularly anxious around the attic door. "You'll want to avoid the attic," she said, almost whispering. "It's cold up there, and it's best to leave it alone." Her voice quivered slightly, and she quickly moved on, as though she regretted mentioning it at all. I thought she was just trying to spook me, but it was clear that she was serious. The rest of the tour went by without incident, and after Margaret left, I was alone. The house had a certain charm, and I was eager to settle in. I made myself a cup of tea, sat by the fire, and lost myself in a book. The first night passed uneventfully. But as I lay in bed, I kept hearing strange noises, creaks and groans from the walls, and the faintest sound of footsteps above me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house settling. After all, it was old. But then, around midnight, something changed. A cold draft swept through the room, and I felt it. A presence. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath in the air. I pulled the blanket around me, trying to warm up, but it didn't help. My body felt numb and my mind raced. I tried to convince myself it was just a chill from the storm outside, but it didn't feel like that. It felt wrong. Then I heard it, a voice, soft at first, like a whisper carried by the wind, but unmistakable. "Help me." I froze. My heart thudded in my chest. The voice was coming from somewhere deep in the house, from above me, from the attic. I sat up in bed, staring at the door. It was the middle of the night, and I was alone. Was I imagining things? Or was there someone in the house? My pulse raced as I got out of bed and grabbed a flashlight. I didn't know what I was hoping to find, but something compelled me to check. The attic door was right at the top of the stairs. I hadn't even noticed it when I first arrived. It blended in with the rest of the hallway, old and creaky. The wooden door was cracked open just a little, as if inviting me in. I stood there for a moment, considering whether I should go up. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and go back to bed, but curiosity got the better of me. I took a deep breath and ascended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The attic was dark, the only light coming from my shaky flashlight. As I reached the top, I could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, like something was waiting for me. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly pushed the door open. What I saw in that attic, I can't explain it. It wasn't like I walked into a dusty, abandoned space. The attic was neat, almost unnervingly so. A single old rocking chair sat in the corner facing the wall. The floor was covered in a layer of dust, but everything was undisturbed, except for one thing. In the center of the room, there was a small, old-fashioned trunk. It was old, wooden, and had a brass lock that glimmered faintly in the dim light. It was the trunk that seemed out of place. I felt drawn to it, almost like it was calling me. The air around me grew even colder as I stepped toward it. I reached out to touch the trunk, my hand trembling, and that's when I heard it again. The whisper, clearer now. "Please, help me." I stepped back, my mind racing. The voice was unmistakable now. It was coming from inside the trunk. I don't know why I did it, but I grabbed the old brass key that was hanging on a nearby hook and unlocked the trunk. The moment I lifted the lid, the temperature in the room plummeted. I felt a wave of icy air hit my face, and I could barely breathe. Inside the trunk was nothing but darkness, deep, impenetrable darkness. Then the darkness moved. I saw it then, a figure barely visible at first, but it grew clearer as my eyes adjusted. It was a woman, pale and ghostly, her face twisted in agony. She was crying out, her hands reaching for me, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring at her, my heart pounding in my chest. "Please, you have to help me, before it's too late." Her voice was desperate, and for a moment I felt an overwhelming sense of sympathy. I wanted to help her, but how? I stepped forward, my breath shallow, my heart racing, but before I could reach her, the figure vanished. The attic went deathly silent. The cold receded, and the air seemed to return to normal. The trunk was closed again, just as it had been before, and everything in the room seemed undisturbed. I stood there, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I left that night, not even bothering to gather my things. I drove down the mountain, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. But as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Something had gotten out of that trunk and was still watching me. When I returned to the town, I stopped at a small diner to calm my nerves. I told the waitress my experience, half expecting her to laugh at me. But she didn't. Instead, her face went pale, and she told me the story of the house. Years ago, a woman had lived there alone. She was a recluse, but one winter she disappeared without a trace. No one knew what happened to her, but people said her spirit was trapped in the attic, unable to escape. The trunk, the waitress told me, had been hers. And now it was clear that whatever had been locked away in that trunk was still there, waiting for someone to set it free. I don't know what that thing was, but I don't ever want to know. I've never gone back to that cabin, and I never will.
Next story.
The cold was unbearable that night, even for winter in the mountains. The air was sharp and biting, cutting through my jacket as I trudged through the snow toward the small cabin. I'd been hiking alone, looking for some solitude to clear my mind after everything that had happened in the past few months. The loss of a loved one can leave a hole in you that's impossible to fill, and I thought maybe the isolation of nature would help me find some peace. The cabin wasn't far from the trail, a simple, rustic structure built long ago with a stone fireplace that I looked forward to lighting when I arrived. I had rented it for the weekend, just me, the wilderness, and the snow. The quiet was supposed to be healing, but something felt off as soon as I stepped inside. The door creaked as I opened it, the smell of old wood and dust filling the air. The fireplace had been left untended, but there were plenty of logs nearby. I set my gear down by the door and quickly started a fire. The warmth spread through the room slowly, fighting against the chill, but I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at the back of my mind. There were no sounds of animals outside, no wind rustling through the trees. It was dead silent, as if the world had stopped breathing. I shrugged off the feeling, settling into the cabin for the night. I had food, warmth, and time to be alone, so I should have felt comfortable, right? But I didn't. As I sat by the fire, the silence pressed in on me. The walls seemed to be closing in, and it was almost like I could hear a faint whispering just beyond my hearing. My heart thudded harder as I looked around the cabin, but there was nothing. No one. I chalked it up to the isolation, to my mind playing tricks on me in the quiet. The loss I had experienced was still fresh, and maybe it was manifesting itself in strange ways. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. I was exhausted from the hike and needed sleep. The fire crackled softly as I lay beneath the heavy blankets, my eyes closing to the darkness of the room. But then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it. A knock. It was faint, soft at first, almost like a whisper against the wind. But there it was again, louder this time. 3 knocks, one after the other. I shot up, heart racing, my breath catching in my throat. Who could be out there? I was miles from the nearest neighbor, and the road was covered with thick snow. No one was supposed to be here. Another knock. Louder, more urgent. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and slowly stood up, my body stiff with fear. I moved toward the door, my mind racing. Who would come out here in the middle of the night? My hands shook as I reached for the handle, but then I froze. The whispering I'd heard earlier, now it was louder. It wasn't just the wind anymore. There were voices, soft and unintelligible, like they were coming from the walls themselves. I hesitated, the flashlight's beam shaking in my hand as I peered through the small window next to the door. Nothing. Just the swirling snow. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. I opened the door slowly, stepping onto the porch, my breath visible in the cold air. The knock had stopped, and the whispering was gone, but the silence now felt even worse. I turned in a circle, scanning the dark woods around me, but there was nothing, no one. Just the snow falling silently on the earth, covering everything in a blanket of white. I was about to step back inside when I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the snow. They led from the edge of the woods near a thicket of trees and stopped right in front of the cabin. They weren't deep, like someone had been walking lightly, almost as if they were floating just above the snow. The prints were recent, too fresh for the storm to have filled them in. My breath caught in my chest. I hadn't heard anyone approach, hadn't seen anyone, but the footprints were right there. I backed into the cabin, my heart hammering in my chest. I closed the door, bolting it shut. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I wasn't alone. The fire was still crackling softly in the hearth, but I couldn't find comfort in its warmth anymore. The room felt suffocating, and the whispering seemed to return, this time louder, clearer. It was as if the voices were speaking directly into my mind. The temperature dropped suddenly. I could see my breath in the air, and my hands trembled as I grabbed the flashlight again. I scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from above. The sound of something or someone walking across the floor of the second story. I froze. The cabin had been empty when I arrived, and I had checked every corner. There was no one else here. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then they stopped directly above me. I could hear the floorboards creaking under the weight of something moving around. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't find my voice. I grabbed my coat, pulling it on quickly, and ran for the door. I didn't care if I was out in the storm. I just needed to get away from whatever was in the cabin with me. But as soon as I reached for the door, it slammed shut by itself. The sound of the footsteps above me grew louder, almost frantic now. Something was moving around up there, something that shouldn't be. I backed away from the door, my heart in my throat, the whispers now growing into full sentences, but still I couldn't understand what they were saying. I ran to the stairs, looking up toward the second floor. There was a faint light up there now, flickering in the darkness. I reached the base of the stairs, and the moment I looked up, the light went out. The whispering stopped, the silence returned. I didn't know what happened after that. All I remember is a rush of cold, the sharp crack of the door bursting open, and then I was outside, running into the storm. The snow was heavy, but I didn't care. I just ran. I don't know how long I ran or how I made it out of the woods, but when I finally stumbled into the nearest town, I was half frozen and delirious. The authorities couldn't find any sign of anyone else at the cabin. The snow had covered everything, erasing any trace of what happened there that night. But I know what I heard, what I felt. Something followed me that night, something old and lost in the cold. I can't go back there, and I won't. I don't care how many years pass. The mountain has its secrets, and some things are better left undisturbed.
Next story.
It was the coldest winter I could ever remember. The kind of cold that gnawed at your bones, leaving you unable to warm up no matter how many layers you wore. I grew up in a small house on the outskirts of a sleepy town in northern Michigan, and winters there were always harsh. But this one, it felt different. It all started one evening. when the snowstorm rolled in. The wind howled, pushing the snow into drifts that made it impossible to see anything beyond the porch. I was alone in the house. My parents had gone to visit my aunt in the city, and my brother had gone off to college. I was fine with being alone, even though the house always seemed a bit too quiet when it was just me. The house had been in the family for generations, a two-story farmhouse that creaked and groaned in the winter cold. The old timbers seemed to have a life of their own. That night, as the storm raged outside, I huddled in the living room with a book and some tea, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that seemed to be creeping into my bones. Every now and then, I'd hear the house settle, but I convinced myself that it was nothing, just the wind, the snow. But when the lights flickered, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Power outages were common during storms, but this felt different. I could feel the presence of something else in the room. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the pages of my book. But then came a sound, a soft tap on the window. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and I set the book down slowly, staring at the glass. The wind had picked up, but that tap was too rhythmic, too deliberate to be the storm. It came again. Tap, tap, tap. I stood up, my feet unsteady beneath me. I approached the window, my heart racing. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a tree branch, maybe an animal. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I pulled back the heavy curtains and looked out into the storm, the swirling snow obscuring everything. I could barely see my hand in front of my face. But there, at the edge of the yard, standing just beyond the reach of the porch light, was a figure. It was tall, cloaked in a dark, tattered coat. It didn't move, just stood there, its face hidden in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back from the window. The tap came again, this time louder, more urgent. I grabbed my phone, dialing my parents' number, but the call wouldn't go through. The line was dead. I tried again. Still nothing. The figure outside stood motionless, as if waiting. A sudden crash from upstairs made me jump, the phone slipping from my hands and clattering to the floor. My blood ran cold, and I ran up the stairs without thinking. As I reached the top, the temperature dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath in the air. The hallway was shrouded in darkness, except for the faint light from the moon filtering through the window at the end. I called out, "Hello? Is someone here?" No answer, just the eerie silence of the house. Then I heard it, a soft scraping noise coming from one of the bedrooms, the kind of noise that made your skin crawl. I crept toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. When I opened the door, I found nothing. The room was empty, but the floorboards creaked, the sound so faint I almost missed it. From the corner of the room, a shadow shifted. My eyes locked onto it, but I couldn't make out what it was. I stepped forward closer to the corner, and the shadow seemed to rise. That's when I saw it. A face, pale and gaunt, eyes sunken and hollow, its lips twisted into a grin. The air grew colder, colder than it had been outside, and I could hear the faint whispering. A voice. No, several voices, whispering in unison. They didn't speak words, but a language I couldn't understand, and it was all around me, in the walls, in the air. I turned and bolted out of the room, running down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the whispers follow me, growing louder, echoing through the house. As I reached the front door, I looked back one last time, but the figure was there again, standing just behind the window, watching me with those same dark eyes. I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I didn't know what to do. I had to leave, but the storm was so fierce. It felt like the world outside had been swallowed up by the snow. I grabbed my coat, threw it on, and rushed out the door. The wind hit me like a slap in the face, and I could barely see anything through the blinding snow. But I didn't care. I had to get out of there. I made it to the old shed at the edge of the yard and huddled inside, trying to catch my breath. The storm was so loud now, the wind screaming like something alive. It wasn't until I looked down at my feet that I noticed the tracks. Fresh tracks, leading away from the shed and disappearing into the woods. And they were no ordinary tracks. They were large, unnatural, like something heavy had been dragged across the ground. I didn't dare follow them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. From the shadows of the trees, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of something white, something pale, but when I turned, there was nothing there. The storm continued to rage for hours, but eventually I could hear sirens in the distance. The town's emergency response team had come to check on the area, making sure everyone was safe. By the time they reached me, I was frozen and barely able to speak. They took me to the local church where I was wrapped in blankets and given hot cocoa. I could still feel the chill in my bones, though. That feeling of being watched, that constant presence, never left me. When I was finally able to speak, I told them about the figure in the storm and the noises in the house, but they didn't believe me. They said I'd probably been seeing things, that the storm had played tricks on my mind, but they didn't know what I had felt, what I had seen. The next morning, when the storm had cleared, I returned to the house to find that everything appeared normal. No footprints in the snow, no broken windows, no sign of the figure, but the house felt wrong. It wasn't the same as it had been before the storm. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. It was as though something had followed me back. I moved out a week later, and I never returned to that house again. The memory of that night stayed with me, haunting me in ways I can't describe. Every winter since, I hear the wind whispering, calling me back to that place. And every time I feel the cold air touch my skin, I wonder if that figure is still out there, waiting for the next person to wander too close to the house.
Next story.
I always thought I was too rational to be scared by ghost stories. The supernatural was just a trick of the mind, a way for people to explain the unexplainable. But after what happened that winter, I learned how wrong I was. My name is Emily, and it was the winter of 2018 when everything changed. I had decided to take a solo trip to a small, remote town in New England. I needed to clear my head after a particularly difficult year, and the idea of being surrounded by snow-covered mountains and forests sounded perfect. The cabin I rented was just outside the town, on a quiet, secluded plot of land. It looked charming from the outside, log cabin style with a stone chimney and a wraparound porch, the kind of place you imagine in Christmas cards. The owner, an older man named Jacob, was kind enough to give me a quick tour before I settled in. He seemed friendly, though a little distant, as if he didn't particularly enjoy having guests around. He mentioned that the cabin had been in his family for generations and that he lived a few miles away in the village, so I'd be alone for the duration of my stay. "The cabin's been here for a long time," he said, with a nervous chuckle. "You'll be fine, but if you need anything, just come down to the village." I nodded, thinking nothing of it. I wasn't worried. I was used to being on my own, and a little isolation sounded perfect. The first night went by without incident. I made a fire, read a book, and relaxed. The wind howled outside, but I felt cozy in front of the flames, the crackling of the wood the only sound in the house. But then, as I was getting ready for bed, something strange happened. I had just turned off the light and was settling under the covers when I heard it. A soft tapping, almost like a knock. At first I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, clearer this time, coming from somewhere near the back of the cabin. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I lay there, frozen, listening. The tapping continued. I got up and cautiously made my way toward the sound, half expecting to find a branch scraping against the window or an animal at the door. But when I reached the back room, everything was still. No branches, no animals. The tapping had stopped, and the house was eerily silent again. I shook my head and went back to bed, trying to dismiss it. It was probably just the old house settling, I thought. But as I lay in bed, trying to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air in the room felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I could feel my heart racing, but I forced myself to close my eyes and drift off. The next morning, I decided to go for a walk around the property. The snow was thick, untouched by footprints, and the trees were covered in a blanket of white. As I wandered, I came across a small graveyard near the edge of the woods. It wasn't very large, just a handful of old, weathered gravestones. They looked ancient, some of them half buried in snow, with names I couldn't make out. I shivered as I stood there, staring at the graves. I wondered why anyone would choose to be buried out here, in such a remote, lonely place. As I turned to leave, I felt a sudden chill on the back of my neck. It wasn't the cold air, but something else, something more unsettling. I hurried back to the cabin, but the strange feeling stayed with me. That night, things took a darker turn. I had just finished dinner and was sitting on the couch, reading, when I heard it again. The tapping. This time it was louder and it was coming from inside the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. The sound was unmistakable. It was coming from the attic. I stood up, trembling. I had no idea why, but I felt compelled to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way to the stairs that led to the attic. The air around me felt thick, suffocating. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended, and then the cold grew more intense the higher I went. At the top of the stairs, the door to the attic was slightly ajar. The faintest glow of light filtered through the crack. I hesitated for a moment, but then the tapping started again, this time faster, almost frantic. I pushed open the door. The attic was dark, the only light coming from the beam of my flashlight. As I scanned the room, I noticed something strange. A rocking chair, sitting in the corner, was moving, slowly creaking back and forth as though someone had just gotten up from it. But no one was there. The cold hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Then I saw it. A figure standing near the far wall. It was a woman, her back to me, dressed in a long, tattered gown. Her hair was long and dark but tangled, as if it had been growing for years without being cut. She stood still, unmoving, and the only sound was the eerie creak of the rocking chair. I couldn't speak. My body was frozen in fear. The woman slowly turned toward me, her face pale and hollow, with eyes that seemed to look right through me. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and in that moment, everything went black. I woke up on the floor, the flashlight still clutched in my hand. The attic was empty. The rocking chair was still, and yet I knew. She had been there. I could feel her presence, like a weight in the air. I ran out of the house that night, barely gathering my things, my mind a blur of terror. I didn't stop until I was back in the village, knocking on the door of the inn where Jacob had told me to go if I needed help. He looked at me strangely when I arrived, but I didn't care. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. Jacob told me later after hearing my story that the house had been abandoned for years before he inherited it. His family had lived there, but they'd all moved away a long time ago. "What did you see up there?" he asked me, his voice strangely calm. I told him about the woman in the attic, the rocking chair, the cold. He nodded slowly, a sad expression crossing his face. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about a woman who lived there a long time ago. She went mad, and she never really left. I don't know if the story was true or if I had just imagined the whole thing, but I'll never forget that feeling, that tapping, the woman in the attic, the cold, and I'll never go back to that house."
Next story.
I never believed in things that went bump in the night, at least not until I stayed in that damn house. My name's Sarah, and I had always thought ghost stories were just that, stories. That all changed one cold winter night when I rented a cabin for the weekend to get away from everything. It wasn't far from town, just a few miles out, nestled deep in the woods. No one had lived there for years, but the listing described it as rustic and charming, and I thought it would be the perfect place for some solitude. It was the dead of winter, a time when snow blanketed the ground like a heavy white shroud. The trees stood tall and skeletal, their bare branches creaking in the wind. The air was biting, and the cold seeped into every bone of your body, no matter how many layers you wore. When I pulled up to the cabin, the first thing that hit me was the silence. Not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, but the kind that feels unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. The cabin itself was small and unassuming, a log structure with a stone chimney and windows that seemed to stare out into the wilderness. There was no one around for miles, and that was exactly what I wanted. I didn't expect anything to be wrong. In fact, I was looking forward to a few days of peaceful isolation. I had no idea what was waiting for me. Inside, the cabin was old. Dust hung in the air, and the wooden floors creaked under my weight, but it had a certain charm to it. A small, cozy kitchen, a crackling fire in the hearth, and a worn couch with a thick wool blanket draped over it. It felt like the perfect place to escape from the hustle and bustle of my life. I set my bag down, unpacked a few things, and lit a candle to ward off the darkness creeping in from the windows. The first few hours were quiet, too quiet almost. I read a book, sipped some tea, and stared out the window at the snow falling softly outside. I began to feel uneasy, though. There was something off about the place. Maybe it was the heavy silence, or maybe it was just the isolation. Either way, I didn't feel right. As night fell, the temperature dropped even lower. I stoked the fire, but it barely kept the chill at bay. The wind outside howled, and the trees scraped against the roof with eerie sounds that sent shivers up my spine. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the storm. But that didn't explain the feeling in the air. Thick, oppressive, like something was watching me. It was around 11 p.m. when it happened. I was curled up on the couch, a blanket wrapped around me, when I heard it. A sound, soft but unmistakable. The creak of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was the wind. It had to be the wind. But then the footsteps came again, this time louder, closer. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I held my breath, listening. The house was old, sure, and sometimes the floors would creak, but this wasn't like that. These were deliberate steps, someone walking, right outside the living room. I gathered the courage to get up, clutching the blanket around me like a shield. I walked toward the hallway, my eyes darting around the cabin, but I saw nothing. The wind howled louder outside, but there was no one there. I made my way to the hallway. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet, but everything looked normal. Too normal. I checked the doors, the windows, everything was locked. Nothing out of place. My mind raced, trying to explain it away, but the unease didn't leave. That's when I saw it. At the end of the hall, the door to the basement was slightly ajar. I knew for a fact I had closed it earlier. I'd even made a mental note to avoid the basement. It was old and creepy, and I wasn't interested in whatever might be lurking down there. But now, the door was open, just a crack. I stood there, staring at it. The air grew colder, and my breath fogged up in front of me. Slowly, cautiously, I approached the door. The faintest smell of something musty and decayed wafted up from the stairs. Something in my gut twisted. "Sarah," the whisper came from behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back to the door. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to know what was down there. But some force was pulling me toward it. I opened the door. The basement was dark, the stairs descending into an abyss of shadow. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing against me, like it was alive. I heard the sound of something moving in the depths below, soft, scraping sounds that seemed to echo from all around. Without thinking, I stepped down into the basement. The air down there was colder, almost frigid, and it smelled like mold and old earth. The light from my phone flickered as I descended the stairs, casting long, wavering shadows. I didn't want to be here, but I couldn't turn back. It was like something had taken hold of me, driving me forward. At the bottom of the stairs, the floor was covered in old, rotting wooden crates and broken furniture. But there, in the center of the room, was something that made my blood run cold. A mirror. It was large, antique, and covered in dust. It had an ornate frame, twisted and dark, like something out of a nightmare. But it was the reflection that caught my attention. There, behind me, I saw something moving. A figure, tall and shrouded in darkness, standing just out of the reach of the light. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I turned back to the mirror and it was gone. But the air felt different now, heavier, more suffocating. "Sarah." The whisper was back, closer this time, coming from right behind me. I could feel it, the cold breath on my neck, the chill that sank deep into my bones. I didn't dare turn around. I ran. I bolted up the stairs, the basement door slamming shut behind me with a deafening bang. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the freezing snow, gasping for breath. But even then, I couldn't escape it. I could still hear the whispering, faint like a wind, calling my name from the house. I didn't go back. I didn't stay another second. I don't know who or what was in that house, but I do know one thing. I will never forget the feeling of those footsteps, those whispers following me, even as I ran from the cabin and into the night.
Next story.
The snowstorm came out of nowhere. 1 minute, the sky was clear, and the next, it was as if the heavens had opened up, dumping snow in thick, suffocating sheets. I'd been driving back home from visiting my friend in the city, and at first the storm seemed like just another bad weather evening. But within minutes, the visibility dropped to nearly nothing. I was on a remote stretch of road, miles from any town take, and the snow quickly turned from a gentle flurry into a furious whiteout. I wasn't sure if I'd make it home safely, but the thought of pulling over in the middle of nowhere felt worse. I pushed on, my headlights barely cutting through the wall of snow in front of me. The road twisted around the thick woods, the trees barely visible against the snow. And then, just as I rounded a corner, my headlights caught something, a figure standing in the middle of the road. My heart skipped a beat. A person? At this hour? In a storm like this? I slammed on the brakes, but the car slid on the slick road, coming to a stop just inches from the figure. My pulse was racing as I stared at it. A woman, pale skin, long dark hair, wearing an old-fashioned white dress that swirled around her feet in the wind. She didn't move. She didn't even look at me. I rolled down my window shouting, "Hey, are you okay? You shouldn't be out here in this storm." No response. I was about to put the car in park and get out to check on her, but something made me hesitate. It wasn't just the chill that ran down my spine. It was her stillness. The unnatural stillness. Suddenly, my car engine sputtered. The lights flickered and the radio popped to life with static, like the air had changed. My breath caught in my throat. The woman was still standing there, her back to me now. Her head tilted slightly, almost as if she were listening to something, or waiting for something. "Hey!" I shouted again, voice cracking. "Do you need help?" Her head turned sharply toward me. Her face was pale, almost ghostly in the dim light, with hollow eyes that reflected no emotion. Her lips parted, but no words came out, only a hollow, breathy whisper. I felt my stomach churn. Something was wrong. I had to get out of there. But when I tried to shift the car into drive, the engine failed entirely. The lights flickered one last time and then went out completely. The figure was gone. I couldn't move. My heart pounded in my chest, and I sat frozen, staring into the empty space where she had stood just moments before. Then the snow began to fall even harder, the wind howling through the trees. I reached for my phone, but the screen remained black. No signal. The storm had taken everything, my car, my phone, and my sense of reality. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The air inside the car had grown strangely cold, and I shivered despite being in a warm jacket. I could barely make out the trees lining the road. They looked like black, skeletal hands reaching out to pull me into the storm. Then I saw it. Movement in the rearview mirror. I whirled around in my seat, but there was nothing there. Still, my skin crawled. Something was watching me. Suddenly, the car lurched forward as if it had started by itself. My heart raced as I gripped the wheel, trying to steer, but the car moved of its own accord, speeding through the storm with no clear direction. The road had become a blur, the lines on the pavement completely obscured by the relentless snow. Then, I saw it again. That woman. She was standing beside the road, her head turned toward the car, her hollow eyes meeting mine in the mirror. I screamed, "What do you want from me?" But she didn't respond. Her face remained emotionless, had her gaze unblinking, as if she were just waiting. The car jolted, and I found myself unable to stop it. It was as if some force beyond my control was guiding it. I couldn't breathe. The temperature dropped further, the frost creeping across the windows inside the car. It was suffocating. I could see the woman now, not just beside the road, but all around me. Her figure blurred in the corners of my vision, her presence growing stronger and more oppressive with every passing second. My breath came in ragged gasps as the shadows around me thickened. I tried to scream again, but no sound came out. The car skidded wildly, veering off the road. I was thrown against the side, the world spinning as the snowstorm swallowed everything whole. My hands gripped the wheel, but it didn't matter. And then, just as quickly as the chaos had started, the car came to a stop. I opened my eyes, disoriented, but the storm had disappeared. The snow had stopped falling, the wind had ceased its wail, there was nothing around me but darkness. The trees, the road, the car, everything was gone. I wasn't in the car anymore, I was standing, hovering. My feet were cold as though I were standing in the snow, but when I looked down, I saw nothing, only endless blackness. And then she was there again, the woman. She stood just a few feet away, her face pale and vacant, her eyes staring directly into mine. This time, I couldn't look away. Something inside me knew that I was no longer in the world I had known. I wasn't just lost, I was trapped. Her mouth opened, but instead of a whisper, a chilling, guttural voice filled the air. "You shouldn't have come back." Her voice was like ice, sliding through every bone in my body. And then I felt it. Something had followed me. Something had been waiting for me for years. And now it was too late to escape. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. I couldn't run, couldn't scream. I was frozen in place. The woman stepped forward, her figure growing larger as the darkness around us seemed to close in. "There is no escape," she whispered. The last thing I remember was the feeling of her cold, icy hands on my shoulders, pulling me into the dark. And then, nothing.
Next story.
I had been planning this weekend for weeks. A getaway to the remote cabin my uncle had left me in his will. A peaceful retreat in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, far from any city lights or people. The kind of place where you can finally relax and forget about the chaos of life. The weather forecast had called for clear skies and mild temperatures, but as I pulled up the long, winding driveway, I could already see dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The air felt heavy, like a storm was coming, but I wasn't going to let that ruin my time alone. I was looking forward to the quiet, the isolation. The cabin itself was old, weathered wood, creaky floors, a stone fireplace, and large windows that opened to the forest. It was just the kind of place I needed. I unloaded my bags, checked the pantry, and started a fire. For the first few hours, everything felt perfect. Then the storm rolled in. It came quickly, and soon the rain was coming down in sheets, pounding the roof, the trees thrashing violently in the wind. The storm was fierce, but I didn't mind. I wrapped myself in a blanket, lit some candles, and curled up with a book by the fire. Outside, the storm howled, but inside the cabin, I felt safe, warm, and removed from everything. At some point, I must have drifted off to sleep because I woke to a strange noise, a knock. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough to rouse me from my slumber. My heart raced as I sat up, still wrapped in the blanket, the fire now just a low, flickering glow. The knock came again, this time louder. I glanced at the window, but it was too dark to see anything. The storm outside was relentless, and I couldn't imagine anyone being out there. Who would be crazy enough to venture out in this kind of weather? "Who's there?" I called, my voice wavering slightly. No response. Only the wind pushing against the cabin with increasing force. I stood up, the blanket falling to the floor, and walked toward the door. My mind was racing, but something about the silence in the cabin felt strange now. Unsettling. I reached for the door handle, but before I could turn it, I heard the knock again. This time it was coming from the back of the cabin. I froze. There was no way anyone could have made it around to the back in this weather. I'd seen no cars along the road when I'd arrived, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. No one was supposed to be out here. No one. My breath caught in my throat as I moved cautiously toward the back door, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached for the knob and slowly pulled it open. The wind howled in, but there was nothing on the porch, no sign of anyone. Just the trees swaying in the darkness, rain slapping against the wood. I stood there, confused and on edge, when I saw it, a shadow. Just for a split second, a dark shape darted past the trees at the edge of the cabin, moving too fast to be anything natural. My instincts screamed at me to slam the door shut, but I stayed frozen in place. Then I heard a voice. It was faint, distant, but it carried through the storm like it was right next to me. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "Let me in." I slammed the door shut and backed away, my heart racing. My mind spun with 1,000 possibilities, but I couldn't explain what had just happened. I didn't want to be paranoid, but I knew something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted, heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. I moved to the window, peering out into the rain. But the darkness outside swallowed everything. The only thing I could see was the faint outline of the trees, their branches swaying violently. Another knock. But this time it wasn't just at the back door. The front door, the windows, the walls. They all came alive with sound, the knocking growing faster, more frantic. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys, rushing to the car, desperate to get out of there. The storm made the road nearly impassable, but I didn't care. I had to leave. Just as I was about to open the car door, I heard it again. "Let me in." But this time it was right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. No one. Just the pounding rain, the wind, and the trees bending beneath the storm's weight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickly got into the car, locking the doors and starting the engine. My headlights cut through the storm as I backed out of the driveway and sped down the winding road, not looking back. The entire drive home was a blur of fear. The rain so thick I could barely see the road in front of me. My mind raced with questions. Had I imagined it all? Was I just tired and paranoid from the storm? But deep down, I knew what I had heard. Weeks later, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I'd made it back home safely, but I couldn't forget the voice, the whisper that had come through the storm. Then, one night, while I was watching TV alone in my apartment, I heard a knock on the door. It was light at first, like someone testing if anyone was inside. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't move. The knock came again, followed by a voice, soft, distant, but unmistakable. "Let me in." I didn't answer. I didn't even get up. The storm that night was gone, but the voice had followed me, carried on the wind, haunting me from that cabin. Maybe it was just a trick of my mind. Maybe it wasn't. But I'm not taking any chances. The storm may have passed, but the voice, the knocking, it hasn't stopped. I haven't gone back to the cabin since. I don't plan to, and sometimes when the wind picks up just right, I still hear it, faint and cold, just beyond my door. Let me in.
Next story.
It was the kind of night that felt like it had never been anything but dark. The kind of night where the moon was hidden behind thick clouds and the wind howled through the trees, making them groan like old men in pain. I was on a late-night drive through the back roads of West Virginia, taking a shortcut to get home. My GPS was on the fritz, so I was relying on the old country roads I remembered from years ago. The night was cold, and the roads were slick with a layer of frost. The headlights of my car cut through the blackness, illuminating the narrow path ahead. The trees lined the road like sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out as though they wanted to snatch my car off the road. I'd been on these roads before, but tonight, they felt different. Empty, somehow. I didn't know if it was just the storm rolling in or something else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I swore I saw something moving in the shadows behind me. But when I looked, there was nothing. I tried to push it out of my mind, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. The storm was picking up and the visibility was getting worse. But then, just as I passed a particularly dark stretch of road, I saw something up ahead. A figure standing by the side of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing as I stared at the figure. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white dress, her long black hair hanging in front of her face like a veil. She stood there, perfectly still, as if she had been waiting for someone. I don't know why I stopped, but I did. My car idled, the engine humming softly, the silence around me pressing in. The woman didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. She just stood there, staring at the ground. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaky. "Are you all right?" No response. I waited for a few seconds, but she didn't move an inch. I was about to drive on, thinking it was just some hitchhiker in the middle of nowhere, when I saw it. Her feet. They weren't touching the ground. Her body seemed to hover just above the road. Her legs unnaturally long, stretched like they didn't belong to a human at all. My blood ran cold. I tried to start the car again, my hands shaking as I reached for the gear shift, but the car wouldn't budge. The engine sputtered and died, and in that moment, the woman looked up. Her face was pale, her eyes completely black, like two empty voids. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The air around her seemed to grow colder, and I felt the car's interior temperature drop several degrees in an instant. I could see my breath in the air as I backed away from the steering wheel. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stare at her, frozen in place, as she floated closer to my car. Her hand reached out, fingers curling toward the window, and I could feel the pull of something ancient, something that wasn't human. It was as though her very presence was draining the life from the air around me. Suddenly, there was a loud bang. Something hit the car, making it lurch to the side. I snapped my head toward the rearview mirror, and I saw it. A figure, shrouded in shadow, was moving rapidly through the trees. It wasn't a person. It was something. Monstrous, its outline shifting and twisting like a dark cloud. I didn't wait. I grabbed the keys and jammed them into the ignition, praying the car would start. The engine sputtered and roared to life, and without a second thought, I slammed the car into drive and tore down the road, not looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, nearly an hour away. My hands were still shaking as I pulled into a gas station, the car's headlights casting long shadows on the empty parking lot. I sat there for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to calm myself. I told myself it had to have been a trick of the mind, some weird hallucination brought on by the storm and my exhaustion. But when I stepped out of the car, I felt it. Eyes on me. The same feeling I had on the road. I looked around, but the gas station was still and empty. Yet, the air felt thick, like something was pressing in. I quickly filled up the tank, my eyes scanning the parking lot, every noise feeling amplified, every shadow stretching unnaturally long. As I finished up, I noticed something strange. On the car window, just above the side mirror, there were long, black scratch marks, deep gouges that hadn't been there when I first arrived. I knew then that I hadn't been imagining it. I drove straight home after that, not taking any more back roads. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Every time I passed a stretch of trees, I saw shadows moving at the edges of my vision. Every night since, the feeling has been there, lurking in the corner of my mind. But it wasn't until last week that I saw her again. I was walking through the park, trying to clear my head, when I saw something familiar. A figure in a tattered white dress, standing just inside the tree line, watching me. I've learned since then not to stop, not to make eye contact, and not to go anywhere near the woods at night. The road to nowhere is sometimes a road you can never leave.